It's hard to describe how obsessed we used to be with zombies for a decade or two. Zombies were all over the place, perfect for low-budget horror films, and they were adaptable enough for anyone to give their take on them, from gory action to kid-friendly video games. People who aren't even avid book readers still probably had a copy of the Zombie Survival Guide and World War Z sitting on their bookshelf. And now, there's barely anything. What used to be a pop cultural staple is now nothing more than a shambling corpse of what it once was, and it seems like zombie media might be done after it reached its natural conclusion, with a Disney Channel made-for-TV musical film.
Welcome to Zombieland. It's a party. Go ahead, everybody dance.
Is this the end of zombie Shakespeare?
So what gives? How did we get here? And is there any room for a comeback? I think to start discussing zombie media, we need to break down what exactly makes a zombie film, comic, show, game, or novel. Of course, the idea of stories where the hero needs to fight off somebody who came back from the dead has its roots in folklore, with the modern idea of zombies coming from a mix of ghouls from early Arabian stories like 1001 Nights, as well as stories of Haitian voodoo magic bringing back somebody as an undead slave, which is where the name zombie comes from. The idea started to take shape with films like 1932's cult classic White Zombie, starring Bela Lugosi, but it wasn't until George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead release in 1968 when zombies as a pop cultural phenomenon as we know it became a thing. Well, Romero referred to his monsters as ghouls, and people just misinterpreted his with the voodoo ones, but hey, the name stuck. A giant swarm of shambling, lifeless corpses with an insatiable hunger for the living. Yeah, people at the time weren't buying it. Outside of a few sequels with Romero himself, some international films, and a bunch of low-budget horror films, and Michael Jackson's Thriller, zombies just weren't really a monster that were used that often. That is, until Resident Evil dropped on PlayStation, and zombie media starts picking up steam fast. And by 2002, we got the film version of Resident Evil and the British release of 28 Days Later, soon followed by 2003's American release of 28 Days, the Dawn of the Dead remake, and the Walking Dead comic book, and zombies would be firmly planted in pop culture enough that we could already get a parody of zombie films in 2004 with Shaun of the Dead.
Oh my god. She's so drunk.
And that film would define many teenagers at the time's entire personality and inspire them to go to film school. Me, I'm talking about me. And I guess one of the first lessons in media literacy is to separate what the plot is and what is the story. The plot is the sequence of events of what's going on. Think Luke Skywalker lives on a desert planet. He finds a mentor, an evil empire kills the only family he knows, meets some allies, and then they take on an evil galactic empire because Luke has a special gift of being a Jedi. That's the plot. And with the story, think of it this way. If the writer had a soapbox that the entire world could hear them for just a few words as possible, what would they say? With the film, what message is being conveyed to the audience? With Star Wars, it's actually about the story of a hero coming from an unlikely place. But where it starts getting fun is when you start to dissect horror apart, because horror stories are almost always cautionary tales. Humanity has always told tales of things like monsters in the woods to keep kids from wandering out into the forest at night. Fast forward millennia and our story became more about what will happen when you meddle with science you don't understand, how cycles of abuse will become generational, or what are you willing to give up in order to survive? So what about zombies? Sure, at first glance you could probably point at some examples where it's a lone survivor taking out a bunch of baddies, but they're monsters so it's fun to watch them get gunned down. After all, blood and guts flying everywhere looks really good in the trailers. Yet, that's not even close to the message behind many of the great zombie stories. That's not even the point of Dawn of the Dead, the debut film of Zack Snyder, a filmmaker who is synonymous with over-the-top spectacle. The constant theme that runs through nearly every single zombie story is actually, will humanity stand united in the face of a crisis? Who's the actual threat in any zombie story? It's certainly not a zombie. One lone zombie is just cannon fodder. You can kill them with a banjo or a cricket bat, and the audience will get a laugh out of it. A zombie by itself is one of the easiest problems most story heroes will probably handle, but a swarm of them? They're all united underneath a single goal and move towards it together. Eat the brains of the living. All humanity can do to fight them is to put whatever problem they have aside and handle this immediate and easy to deal with threat head on. It never works out that way, does it? The zombies are secretly a backdrop to many intrapersonal problems against a common goal. The original Night of the Living Dead wondered if we'd overlook racial differences and come together. Dawn of the Dead and its remake Ask if we'd put unity over consumerism. 28 Days Later was if we'd stand together against the government overreach after 9/11. Then there are the zombie films where the antagonist is the person trying to prevent the unity from happening. Umbrella Corporation in Resident Evil, Young-Suk, the business executive in Train to Busan, and the ghost pirate from Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island. I'm just saying, if Shaggy survived actual zombies, actual ghosts, actual witches, actual aliens, actual vampires, and just so much more, you'd think that he wouldn't fear just some dude in a mask. Or is it because that he's dealt with so many real monsters that have tried to actually kill him that he's developed PTSD from his time with Mr. Ink?
I keep warning you, but you won't believe me until I finally get eaten.
With a wide array of zombie stories to pick from, we all remember the truly magnificent ones. The ones that moved us, that captivated us, or became the most quoted movie for a while. But there's also a bunch of stinkers in there, a lot. And that's the first major blow to the zombie genre. I'm of the opinion that if there's a creative vision and a great team dedicating themselves behind and in front of the scenes, then there's no such thing as a bad piece of art. I can kind of flip that switch off in the back of my brain when I'm watching campy low-budget films because if the story is good, I could care less about what the budget looks like. The Evil Dead films were made with basically a few $1,000s, some duct tape, and a dream. Yet, they're some of my favorite movies. What I mean by bad films are the lifeless cash grabs. The films that some executive greenlit because they saw the popularity of zombies in the 2000s were told they had a huge ROI because they could give the director basically chump change, and they expected the money to roll in. It's like how the Resident Evil films were amazing, but for some reason, they got a little bit worse and worse with each film. What started out as a dramatic retelling of the games from another person's perspective eventually became about clones, and then she got superpowers, and then there's a big fist fight in the White House to save humanity. It had the aesthetics and character cameos of the original game, but none of the actual story or heart. It was never outright bad, but it definitely stopped being good. I can go on and on about all the lazy cash grabs, like the Night of the Living Dead 3D, which was a remake of the original because it wasn't properly copywritten back in the day, and now it stripped away the allegory of racism and added in a bunch of boobs and cheap effects. Or the weird film adaptation of World War Z that only took the name from the book and the idea of how the world would handle a zombie outbreak, but it could have been so much better if the entire film was just the novel's Battle of Yonkers, an entire chapter of just soldiers preparing for an unstoppable horde. More of the focus was on the soldiers coming to terms with the fact that they're going to get hit with a giant wave of death, and there was nothing they can do to stop it. I mean, the novel wholly misunderstood how tanks and artillery work, but it's a more engaging story if you overlook it, so it gets a pass from me. But yeah, enough of the bad. The greatest work of fiction that grabbed the attention of the entire world, The Walking Dead, both the comic book and the show. And nothing encapsulates the idea of striking while the iron is hot quite like The Walking Dead television series. This was must-see TV in an era where cable was on decline. The show had a perfect mix of action, drama, suspense, and I would argue that it cracked the binge-watching formula that gave rise to Netflix and the streaming services. The zombies were always present and pushed the plot along, but the real threat was always from the other survivors. Can Rick and Shane put their feelings aside about Lori for the betterment of the group? Can Rick and the gang stand up to the governor's authoritarian community? Can Rick's vision for a rebuilt society coexist with Negan's? And yet, from what I've seen from most people, the moment they stopped watching was also the moment they cut out cable entirely, either because they stopped watching because they didn't want to pay for cable, or because the show lost them and that was the only reason that they were willing to drop $100 a month for a box underneath the TV. The TV series would continue until season 11, with the new bad guys being the zombie-worshipping cultists known as the Whisperers, and the militaristic gang called the Reapers. And again, I wouldn't even say the show became outright bad, just it was no longer gripping as it once was. Personally, I think if you stopped watching after they defeated Negan, you probably closed the book at the right time. The comics would also continue on with the Civil War brewing within the Commonwealth, death prevents it, and everyone just lives happily ever after that. But the reason that I think the show never got to this point is because 1, the decline in ratings, and 2, the production delays caused by the COVID-19 outbreak. So did COVID kill zombie media? Well, I mean, every single one of us now has firsthand experience with how a viral disease can spread and how easily we are divided over the smallest, dumbest non-issues. I'm not saying that we probably wouldn't all come together to do the bare minimum to keep us all safe in the face of an easily solved problem, but now we do know which one of our coworkers would definitely get bitten by a zombie and not tell anyone about it. I mean, that would be a convenient answer. All the oversaturation of low-effort zombie films, the declining ratings of things that used to be great, and the final nail in the coffin was the real global pandemic. I say zombies have seen much better days. Except, no. Just like how horror films of the last few years have started leaning more into the introspective looks at mental health or societal relationships, films with an actual story to tell, so too are zombie films. Within the last few years since the pandemic, there's the Korean film Alive, which came out just after lockdown and unintentionally had the plot of a video game streamer trapped inside of his apartment during the apocalypse and how the story of isolation affects you. Then there's Army of the Dead, a spiritual successor to the Zack Snyder Dawn of the Dead reboot, but this time we got all of the over-the-top goodness that we love and expect from what his career would eventually become, with a heist movie during a zombie apocalypse. And it's actually a very good story about how expendable the government treats its veterans and soldiers. It's absolutely not high cinema, but it is peak Snyder, and I enjoyed it. And if you need proof that the zombie genre will rise from the grave, may I present to you the new king of zombie media, The Last of Us television series. Based on the video game series of the same name, it takes place 20 years after the initial outbreak, and humanity has been scattered into tiny little settlements with roving bands of hunters spread throughout. The main character, Joel, has lost everything and everyone close to him over the years, and now it's up to him to take a young girl who's immune to the infection, Ellie, across the country to find a cure. The infected are slightly different from the typical zombie, being more based on the cordyceps that infect and kill ants in our real world, and give the appearance of being taken over by a zombie mushroom. It's not, yet it's not? Whatever. It still follows the basic structure of a zombie show. The world is basically destroyed, the undead are unified, and there's the other living people that prevent unity like we've seen 1,000 times over. As for the show, and with the game, it focused on just the personal story of Joel as he learns to let one person into his life and protect this doomed little girl. It isn't about will all of humanity unify for the greater good, it's just about if one person is willing to let another person into his heart. The show's only major departure from the games was entirely focused on a side episode with little plot relevance to the rest of the series, but hammered in the theme of love shining through in the worst of places. It was about Bill, a paranoid survivalist building a doomsday paradise for himself, until he reluctantly takes in Frank, a lone wanderer, and the two live out their lives in happiness together. I still think this is the greatest episode of television HBO has ever produced. And that's saying something. The zombie stories of the past where the entire focus was just on the blood and guts are over. Both the audience and storytellers have matured into wanting more from our genre, and I'm excited to see where we go next. What do you guys think? Will we ever see a true resurgence of zombie films like we did in the 2000s, or is it better left dead? Let me know in the comments below. And of course, if you enjoyed today's video, please hit that like button and subscribe for more weekly content on comic books and nerd stuff. I've been Eric, and you've been awesome.